let's do one more ArrayList example. So we're going to write a small program to do some things with quiz scores. So we're going to ask the user to enter in some quiz scores, we're going to put them in a list, and then we're going to write some methods to find and remove the minimum, calculate the average, return a list of characters associated with the quizzes. So, A, B, C, D, whatever. Now you might think of a class that you could design that would support this kind of functionality, but for now we're just going to write direct methods because I just want to focus in on, again, another example of how to use an array list. So we're going to just write our code inside of main, and so I'm going to start with declaring my array list. And because I'm going to hold quiz scores, those could have a decimal portion, so I'm going to actually have this hold type double, and I'll call it my score list. Now again, remember when you initialize on the right-hand side, you have the choice of either including that type again or omitting it. I actually usually include it because, oops, it's not correct to leave off the caret brackets at all. And so I'm often afraid that if I don't put the type, I'll forget to put the bracket. So usually I will just include it the second time, but it is optional starting in Java 7. Now we have to, of course, import from the util package. Okay, so we're going to start with filling up the score list. So I'm going to write a separate method to do that. So I'm going to call it public static void fill up score list. And I'm going to pass in that score list into this method to fill it up. So I'm going to create a scanner object to read in scores from the user. Now you could think about different ways to do this. You could read in scores until they enter a sentinel value like -1, or you could ask them in advance, how many scores are you going to enter? Or you could ask them after each score, do you have another to enter? Do you have another to enter? Do you have another to enter? So lots of different ways that you can structure this. I'm just going to pick one of them, and I'm just going to ask the user up front how many scores they're going to enter. And then I'll read that in. I always like to use the integer.parseInt with scan.nextLine as opposed to scan.nextInt. And the reason for that is if you go back and forth between reading in numeric input and reading in text input using scan.nextInt and scan.nextLine, that it can be problematic. And so even though in this particular program I might only be reading in numbers, I just usually like to get in the habit of using that because it's possible that in the future I'd come back and add additional code where I'm reading in text, and then that can be a really kind of nasty bug to figure out. So I'm just going to get into the habit of using that. Okay, so because I know in advance how many numbers the user is going to enter, I'm going to use a for loop. And each time I'll say enter the score. And then I'll read it in. And just like we use integer.parseInt, we can use double.parseDouble, and then I'll add it to the score list. So let's start with that method. And afterwards, let's just print it out. And let's run and test this. So here we go. We'll print it. We'll run it rather. And it's going to ask me how many scores I want to enter. Once my Eclipse catches up. Eclipse gets very slow when the video is running. Okay, let's enter 5, and we have 100, an 81.2, a 93, an 84, and an 88.1. There we go. There's our list of scores. Okay, so keep note that every time we add it, it added to the end, right? That's what the add method of ArrayList does. It adds it at the end of your list. So the first grade I entered in, score I entered in was first, second was second, and so on. The index of this 100 is 0. The index of this 81.2 is 1, right? Because our ArrayList is 0-based indexing. Okay, so now I've read in my list. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write a method to find and remove the minimum score. So I need to think about how I can do this. Now you can kind of think about this as a two-step process. The first might be finding the minimum, and then the second might be removing that minimum from the list. Okay, so let's take a look at our at our remove options that we have in ArrayList. So we have a remove that removes from the index and a remove that removes a particular object. Okay, so what we can do is we can think about which one of those we want to use. And it partly depends on whether we want to have a separate method to find the minimum or whether we want to put this all in one. So if we wanted to write two separate methods, one to find the minimum and one to remove the minimum, then most likely we'd use this remove method, because the idea would be the method that finds the minimum would find the minimum value. We could then ask that method to give us the minimum value and we'd remove it from the list in our remove method. But if we're doing it all at once, then we can use either one. Okay, so I'll show you what it looks like to do it all at once, and then I leave it up to you as an exercise to think about how could you modify this to kind of split it into two separate methods such that one finds the minimum and then another one removes it, which would actually probably be more useful because there might be plenty of times you want to find the minimum that you then don't want to take it off the list. But for now, I'm just going to write one method to do both things. So I'm going to write a public static void find and remove minimum score. And again, send in my list. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is I need to find the minimum. Now, I'm going to assume that there's something on my list. I should probably do some error checking, put in code to make sure of that, because what would happen if there wasn't anything on my list? But I'm going to assume the list is not empty. Oh, actually, let's just add the error checking. So what I can do is I can just actually invoke that method is empty. That tells us if it's empty. And I'm only going to do this if it's not empty. If you give me an empty list, I don't have to do anything, right? Because the minimum doesn't exist. There's nothing to remove, so I'm all set. So I can just assume that there's something on there if I'm inside this conditional. The list is not empty. Okay. So what I can do is I can find the minimum value first. So I'm going to say the minimum is, and I'm going to start out by assuming the minimum is at the first position, position 0. Okay. So I'm going to, again, there's something on the list, so I know something is at position 0, and this is a good approach for finding minimums, finding maximums, things like that, is you always assume it's in the first position, and then you sort of search through the rest of the list and compare that current value to every other value until you find one that is now the new minimum or maximum or whatever it is you're looking for. So I can use a loop. Now, depending again on what remove method I want to use, if I want to remove based on the index, I also need to keep track of the index. So I'll say the min index. I'm assuming that it's 0. Okay. But now because I care about the index, I have to use a regular for loop. I can't use a for each loop because I do care about the index, and for each loops don't have an index. So I have to use a regular for loop, and that loop will start at 0, go less than score list.size, and increment each time. Okay. And what I'll do is I'll get the current score off the list using the get method at that index. And I'll say, okay, well, if that current score is less than the min, then guess what? That's the new min. The min gets that current score, and the min index gets I. That's the location. Okay. So now at the end, once I have found that minimum, what I can do is I can say score list.remove that min index. Okay, so let's now test this out. Okay, so again, it'll ask me how many I want to enter. 100, 94.3, 72.1, 88.4, 92.4. Okay, so there's our list of scores, your list after removing the min, and of course it helps if I actually print the list again. So let's try that again. Okay, 100, 92 point, oops, I don't want to enter 100 scores. Let's try that one last time. Let's enter 5 scores, and there we go, 100, 92.4, 81.3, 72.4, 88.1, 90. There we go. Okay, so there's my 5 scores. The minimum is my 72.4, and you can see that it's then removed from the list. Now, if you were really testing this, you'd want to test it in a lot of more cases than that, you'd want to test with the minimum being in the first position, with the minimum being in the last position, with the minimum being in the middle. You'd want to think about what happens if the minimum is repeated. The way I've written this code is only going to remove the minimum one time. Is that the way you want it to work, or would you want it to remove every minimum, every time the minimum value shows up? So lots of different things to think about. But again, I kind of leave that up to you as an exercise. Okay, and then we're going to calculate and return the average score. So here I'm going to say public static, my return type is now going to be a double because I'm finding the average. Now here again, I do want to assume that there is something in the list. If there isn't, I think in this case it actually would make sense to throw an exception, because there is no, I have to return something, and I don't want to return like a 0, because then it could actually be that someone thinks the score list has an average of 0. And there isn't any kind of key indication. Maybe I could return a -1, but I think the best thing to do here would be to return, or to throw an exception saying, hey, I can't calculate the average of an empty list. But since we haven't talked about exceptions yet, I'm going to just, for now, I'm going to assume the list is not empty. Okay. So what we'll do is we will find out the total, initialize it to 0, and then we'll sum up the total. Now in this case, I can use an enhanced for loop because I don't care about the index. And I'll just sum it up, get the total, and then I can return the total divided by scorelist.size. Okay, so let's print that out. And let's test it. Oops. Calculate. Helps if I spell the methods right. Okay. All right. 198.4, 56.2, 84.3, 91.5. There we go. There's our average. Okay, and with the minimum removed. One other thing, you might consider adding in this fill up score list some error checking to make sure scores are within the appropriate range, right? So not letting someone enter a score of 200 or -40, right? So if you wanted to do that, what you could do is you could add some error checking here, but you'd have to think carefully about how you're going to read in the next value. So you could either put a loop inside the for loop, or you could kind of decrement I if the value is invalid. So again, I leave that up to you. That's a really good exercise to practice adding in the kind of range checking into this fill up score list method. All right, but for now, let's do the last, return a list of character grades associated with the quizzes, okay? So here, our return type is going to be an array list, but the array list is going to hold characters. Now, I'd like it to just hold chars, but char is a primitive, so it can't hold char. So it's going to hold character objects, get grade list, and it'll take in that score list. Okay, so what we want to do inside this method is first we want to create the list that we're going to return. I'll call it my grade list. And again, I can either include the type again on the right-hand side or not. Either way, I do have to include the caret brackets, and I always have to include the type on the left-hand side. Now, do I need to take any special consideration if my score list is empty? Or can I could just return an empty grade list, right? So I'm just going to return this grade list, and if score list is empty, then that should be the right thing. But if it's not, I want to go through and I want to add in the associated character grade to go with each one of my scores. So I'm going to have a loop. I can use an enhanced for loop because I don't care about the index. So I'll say for every score in my score list. So I'll get the score, and then I need to do some conditional checking, right? And I'll say, okay, if the score is greater than or equal to 90, then grade list.add the character A. Okay. Otherwise, now here I'm going to use a linked if, else if, else if, right? Because only one of these conditions is going to be true. If it's greater than or equal to 90, then I want to stop. I don't want to check or anything else. Otherwise, if it's greater than or equal to 80, I can add B. Now, will this work correctly if the score is, say, 95? It will, right? Because here, this conditional will be true. We'll add the A, but then remember with the linked if else if, as soon as you find a match, you're done. You don't continue to look for other matches. So I will never go on to checking this second, conditional to add the B. So we're only going to execute one branch of this conditional. So let's finish up for the other scores. So if the score is greater than or equal to 70, we will add a C. And let's just say those, oh no, I guess we'll do a D. And then we're going to have an else to add in an F. Okay. Now we're certain that the scores will always be in the same position as the grade, the letter grade, because for every single score on the list, we're adding one thing to the grade list, right? Because there's an else, one of these branches is guaranteed to execute. So the length of our grade list will always be the same as the length of our score list. Again, if score list is empty, this for each loop will just be totally skipped over and we'll return an empty grade list. So that'll be fine too. So we can now print that out. Your grades are okay. So let's run this one last time. 92.4, 84.3, 62.1, 68.4, and 84.3. Okay, so there's our list of scores. After removing the minimum, that's our average, and our grades are an A, a B, a D, and a B. Okay, so there is one more example of using an array list. Hopefully you're starting to get the hang of how you use it, how you iterate through, how you add things, how you can remove things. Array lists are very handy. They're great to use, and you'll definitely use them as you move forward in your programming.